Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of SuperCoach, mates. Well, last episode we looked at the defenders. Today we're going to look at the all-important midfielders. So it's basically going to be the same sort of go as last episode. So for those of you who haven't watched our defenders episode yet, please go and watch that. But basically, we're going to be sort of looking at two players who are similarly priced and perhaps giving our thoughts and opinions on whether you should sway one way or not, or perhaps pick both or avoid both. So it should be a little bit of a helpful guide if you're sort of tossing up between two different players and you just need sort of a bit more of a third opinion or whatnot. So as per normal, I'm joined by Thomas. How are you, Thomas, on this very hot Melbourne Saturday?
Yeah, not too bad, Nath. Actually had some time to watch the 3 and a bit quarters of the St Kilda Carlton Pracky game, which wasn't too bad. So nice to see us getting another one over Carlton, even though it is February. But it's good to see footy back, and yeah, these as early as these Pracky games present itself, it does give some sort of insight on who's making the best 22 or best 18 at this point in time. But yeah, definitely interesting times ahead as we kind of ramp it up even next week when the official Pracky games start and we have a better idea exactly about who's going to make the round one squads. But without further ado, we'll kick things off with the first two midfielders on screen, and probably the most important two that people have been talking about all pre-season. That's Marcus Bontempelli and Nick Dacos. Obviously, both over 600k, both averaged well into the 120 averages. I've just realised I've made a mistake on the slide there. I've put Dacos's high score twice, so ignore that. Dacos's average was, just let me bring it up, 117.2. So my blunder there, doing these late at night doesn't help. But for definitely two players that I've tinkered with at the moment. Interesting to see your thoughts, Nathan, on exactly have you got both or starting one or fading one? And especially being a Collingwood supporter, you probably have a bit of insight onto Dacos in particular. But what are your thoughts on these two kind of heavyweights as they're touted as being, to some regards, even though they weren't exactly M1, M2 in that order last year. But what are your thoughts on these two? Are you picking both or fade in one? What's your go with these two heavy dogs?
Yeah, well, I think for me the discussion is very easy here. I think you just pick both of them. I don't see either of them dropping away. I mean, if you saw Nick Dacos, he played a half against Brisbane and was by far and away the best player on the ground. So I think that's enough said with Dacos and Bontempelli. I think you know what you're going to get with Bontempelli. These two were basically the first two players who I picked in the game in the midfield. I do have a third player there at the minute. But yeah, these two I think are just must have. I'm not afraid of Bontempelli's sort of price dropping off or anything. If I have a look last year, the cheapest he got was 614k. 614k. So even if you hold off on him, you're still going to have to find 600k at some point to bring him in, unless he had an injury-affected game. So I think it's just much easier just to start off with him and just enjoy the ride with him. He's probably going to be in your side anyway. So just save yourself the pain and, pick him. And Nick Dacos, well, his cheapest price was, sort of that towards the back here. Although he did have a 186 against Melbourne to finish off the year. But, I think sides are going to go sort of after Nick a bit more this year. But, yeah, you just have to look, firsthand as a Collingwood supporter. And, he's a freak with what he can do. So if you're tossing up between one, I would probably lean towards Bontempelli, as controversial as that might. But realistically, I think both of them are probably very safe, top two, top three midfielders come the end of the year. So if I just quickly trade out someone, so like if I have a look, Bontempelli was 1 and Nick Dacos was 5, but he was 4th in terms of the pure midfielders. So you know what you're getting with both of them. You can't start with all of them, but I think out of the names that are in the top 8 from last year, I
Mhm.
think only the 3 that I've got, which are Bontempelli and Nick Dacos, and the third one I've got is Zach Butters. I think they're the only ones who I probably have any confidence sort of starting off with from that higher price range.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think just pick both of them. You'll save yourself a world of pain. But yeah, if you're gonna pick one of them only, I would go Bontempelli because I think Dacos, because he is young, he still might cop a tag and he might still have, a lower score. Whereas Bontempelli, you know what you're getting with him week in, week out. So yeah, ideally start both of them, but if you can only start with one, I would probably lean towards Bontempelli. Are you the same thinking, Thomas?
Yeah, I'll give my 2 cents in a minute, but what I just want to quickly get your opinion on two things, Nathan, in particular, and this will be a common trend, particularly with the early buy players. Are you worried at all? You've got a lot of players on that buy that share it with Collingwood. Is there some concern with the buy factor that you're basically missing out on a premium score that you can get the same of with the Butters or Sarong or whoever else you pick in that price category? And I guess the second question is there any? I know that I saw a bit of that Collingwood Pracky game, that three-way kind of setup that they did um, earlier this week. Is there any concern from your opinion about this foot issue that he's had? I don't think that the commentators really mention it as a problem when they saw him play. He definitely lit the house on fire. But as a kind of super coach owner, are you worried that that is something that might flare up come the start of the season, or is that something that is just going to be safe as houses as we start round one or opening round?
Um, well, we'll start off with the foot issue. So I have no doubt that if it does flare up again, he is going to miss games. And with the way that he plays, it will impact his ability to cover the ground, not being at 100%. So there is that risk with with picking him, I suppose, is that if that plantar fasciitis injury does flare up, he might miss a few games. But I'm just having a look here now. So with regards to the buys, so realistically, I think the only teams who I would be safe as houses picking are I did have them. St Kilda and Fremantle have the buy in round 13, and that's it. For
Yeah,
those two sides for the year, other than opening round, which of course isn't counted in SuperCoach scoring. So realistically, unless you're going with Brayshaw, Sarong, Jack Steele, and you're sort of heavy loading on those St Kilda guys, or the Fremantle players, realistically, I think you sort of just factor that in when you're sort of planning for that game for the bye. So they had the bye with Sydney both the same week. Collingwood. So obviously, Heaney, Warner, Golden, those guys are going to miss the same week as Nick Dacos, both the buys. So realistically, I think if you're going to pick between sort of, if you are going to look at the buys early on, realistically, I think you're probably leaning towards Nick Dacos anyway ahead of those Sydney guys. Well,
yeah,
I definitely am anyway. Um, So I think with Nick Dacos, I think he's that good that you sort of just put him in and you sort of just work out, later on what you're going to do with the buys. Because I think he's just that good that I think if you don't have him from the start, I think he's going to burn you. I think he did that a lot in his second year. I think a lot of people held off on him on his second year, sort of with the same thing. They weren't sure if he could back up from year one, and I think he averaged about 20 points more, and he basically burnt everyone who didn't start with him.
yeah,
So realistically, the only thing that I feel like is going to come into consideration is whether or not you think that plantar fasciitis injury is going to flare up again, which unfortunately it can flare up We've seen with Tom Mitchell, his teammate, with it being ongoing for a long time now, basically a whole year. That if it's not properly managed, it can really, I guess, burn into you. But I've got no doubts that Nick Dacos will overcome that. But yeah, it is something to keep your eye on. So just to summarise, the buys, don't worry about it, and the plantar fasciitis injury, yes, it is a concern, no doubt. Which is another reason why I said go with Bontempelli if you've got to pick only one of them. But yeah, I know what I'm getting with Nick Dacos, and I'm happy to take that risk on him because I know what he's capable of.
Yeah, no, I do agree with you there. I think, like I've had both currently in my side. I do understand the buy factor in regards to the fact that if you do decide to go against the majority and not pick him, and you get burnt in the first 2 rounds, really, that can hurt big time. But I guess on the flip side, is it worth missing out on a premium score round 3? And you've got to factor in the consideration. You've got those Sydney players, which a lot of people have. You've got the Brisbane players, a lot of people have. So it'll be interesting to see what people do decide come round or opening round, if they do decide to pick Nick Dacos or kind of sacrifice him until after his bye. And I guess the benefit is you're not waiting too long to bring him in after his bye. It's not like he's had multiple price rises or anything before you bring him in. So there is that potential that you can get him later. Having said that, I'm probably a little bit hesitant removing him to start with, just how well he played in that Pracky game, when that match simulation game against the Lions and the Suns in that 3-way header. So, yeah, definitely interesting. But I think if I had to pick between the two, I'd probably go Bontempelli just for the safety and assurity of it all. I think he just has this thing with champion data as well. He's a bit of a champion data's love child in the fact that he just gets points for fun. He's low of 73 and his high of 186 there from last season. Just highlights how dominant he can be. And from forward of centre as well, he's just so dominant, being able to push forward and kick goals. And for SuperCoach in particular, a little bit different AFL fantasy, but SuperCoach-wise, you can definitely have that ridiculously high scoring consistently. And I think it's one of those things that you just pay up and don't worry about it. It's easy to have him from the start of the season. He might fluctuate a little bit, but he's probably not going to go, sub 600K at all, if not sparsely throughout the season. So, paying 680 and just copping it and just riding the wave or the high scores where you can is definitely the way to go. And I think if I had to pick between the two, probably Bontempelli is the way to go.
If I can just butt in, sorry. So with Collingwood's bye being round 3, so if you do choose to wait on Nick Dacos, he actually won't have a price change. So you sort of almost, if you're going to wait on him, you sort of almost, because opening round's not counted as part of the scoring this year, you sort of basically do have a free crack on him for 2 weeks. So if you are not picking him, you've basically got the Port Adelaide game and the Western Bulldogs game to have a look at him and see how he sort of goes. So that does come into consideration. But even then, I still think you're mucking around with trades and whatnot. I think it's just easier to start with him. So last year against Port Adelaide, he scored 133. And last year against the Dogs, he scored 156. I don't think they're going to be tagging him. They're not sides who tag anyway. So realistically, if you're banking on him starting off the season slowly and he comes out with 133 and 156, well, then you're basically wasting a trade to get him in when you could have just started with him and copped the 0 from the start. So there is that thing too. But yeah, I just think it's just crazy not starting with him myself. But that might be just Collingwood bias coming in. So
Yeah, fair enough. Nah, definitely one to ponder if you can, if you can afford the two to start with, go for it. But yeah, if we had to pick one in particular, probably Bontempelli takes the chockies there. Just with regards to that buy factor and also just maybe a little bit more consistency of that super high ceiling. But yeah, both are excellent options come round 1. But moving on to the other 600K options, we got a couple more to go through. 2 more that hit the page here: Zach Butters versus Lachie Neale. both similar mould in the fact they're both small in and under midfielders. They get the job done contested wise. They're super, super important for being able to get the ball outside to the outside runners inside 50 to get the inside 50 entries ticking along, and they're so important for their ball movement for both sides, and that correlates quite nicely with SuperCoach scoring, as we see here. Both, Butters is basically bang on 120 average in the 2024 season, and then Lachie Neale just a tick under. Interesting to see, or maybe not interesting for SuperCoach players of old, but yeah, Lachie Neale probably hasn't had the love from SuperCoaches in probably seasons gone by, and most recent times with a 7% ownership at the moment. Whereas Butters is super popular again, and I can see, as Nathan mentioned, that was his M3 at the moment. 26% owned. What are your thoughts on these two in particular? I know Butters probably didn't have his best game against the Crows in that match sim. I know their ones team or their seniors team played 3 quarters and then the rest of them for the last one, so it's probably not a great indication of how he's going to go. What are your thoughts on these two? Can these two rival the likes of Bontempelli and Dacos? Is there a world that you can, basically fade those most expensive players to start with and kind of cash in an extra 40K and get these guys in? Or is there's levels above in regards to Bontempelli and Dacos? What are your thoughts on these two?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think if you're not starting with Bontempelli, you've probably got both of these guys in there, I would say, to compensate for not starting with Bontempelli. Realistically, I think both of them are quite viable options. As I touched on, out of the sort of the 600K plus midfielders, I think the 4 who we've discussed are the only ones who I really had any confidence in picking. So realistically, I don't think you can go wrong in any of these 4 players who we've just touched on. Just for me, I've gone with Zach Butters at the minute, just purely because of the price. I know it's only 3K difference, but sorry, that didn't make sense. Sorry. I've gone with Zach Butters at the minute, purely just because I don't know how Brisbane are going to come back after the premiership. We have seen the premiers the last sort of few years completely miss the finals entirely. But then you look at Brisbane's match simulation on Friday or Thursday, whenever they played against Collingwood, and you go, they look primed, they look ready to attack again. And Lachie Neale basically rivaled Nick Dacos for that first sort of period that they played as well. So realistically, I don't expect either of them to not be in the top 8 this year. But I feel like as Brisbane are the reigning premiers, I feel like sides are going to sort of strategize against them a bit more. And we have seen that Neale can be susceptible to attention from previously. So I think just purely based on personal preference, I think I would rather go with Butters than go with Neale. But as I said, both of them are very viable options. I'm not going to, go at you if you've got Lachie Neale or if you make a case for Lachie Neale. I can perfectly understand that. And as I said, I'm a huge supporter of Lachie Neale. But I think just for me, I think Butters is just slightly ahead of Neale. But as I said, if you've got Neale, I can definitely make a case for him. But yeah, I feel like if you don't have Bontempelli, you probably should have both of these as your 1-2 punch in midfield. But as I said, because I've got Bontempelli, I can probably realistically only afford one of them, and the option I've gone down is Zach Butters at this stage. But as I said, Lachie Neale, super impressive. Normally a very consistent score. You know what you're going to get from him. But yeah, I think there is the other factor because Neale played round 3 as well as Nick Dacos. I just couldn't find space for both of them. So I think for me, it's probably a toss-up between Neale and Dacos at the minute, and obviously the Collingwood scarf's wrapped tightly around my neck, and also the sort of the 13K difference between the two, I think sort of leans me towards Dacos slightly. But yeah, I think both are viable picks. I think both will be most people's final sides by the end of the year. But yeah, I think for me at this stage, I'm just favouring Butters more than Neil, purely because of the fact that Brisbane have the bye. So I know people have been talking about Nick Dacos and waiting after his bye. Well, Lockie Neal's in exactly the same boat for me. In that if he, it might be worth waiting for him after his bye just to sort of get a couple of games and see how Brisbane are going.
Yeah.
And if they're fit and firing, like they were in that preseason game, well then you might consider bringing him in after round 3. But yeah, I think for me, he's that player who I'm sort of happy to sit and wait on until after Brisbane's bye to bring him in. And that's sort of my take on these two.
Yeah,
Do
I
you
do
agree?
agree. Yeah, I do agree in that sense. I don't think you can have Neil and Dacos in the same team round 0 or round 1.
Yeah,
You're sacrificing way too much. 2 premiums is at that stage when you basically need your premiums to fire because your rookies are so volatile at that early part of the season. I don't think it's worthwhile. Lockie Neal is one of those players. Yeah, 7% ownership just shows how underrated or you know underrated and underpicked he is. Start of the season, there's a lot of those Sarongs, Butters, Merritts that people are going ahead of him, but he's just super consistent as well. Didn't go below 70 at all last season. Did a high of 179, just showed the competition what he's made of, and averaged 119.9 in a premiership season. The year before was 110, so he improved on that average as well. The only knock I've got on Neil, and I guess it's more significant than others, is he's not getting any younger. He's still aging as all midfielders do, and I guess with the Lions they have to find ways they can really bolster that midfield and make it more explosive and whatnot to keep up with the competition. And as you said, they're the hallmark in the fact they won the premiership last year. But teams will, as you said, strategize to try and find ways and holes into that midfield group. And I think the likes of now Will Ashcroft probably going to be a mainstay in there for years to come. You got Levi Ashcroft as well, who's going to be probably in that midfield rotation in the near future as well. So what does that mean for Neil? Does he have the M1 position in there for the immediate or near future, or do they start shifting him into different parts of the ground to help with maybe the tag and allow the likes of Ashcroft to flourish in that midfield? Who knows? And I don't know if that'll impact his scoring overly too much, but I think, in comparison to these other younger midfielders who are scoring, if not the same, if not better, I'd probably lean to someone like a Butters. I don't have Butters in my side as of yet, just from a pricing perspective. But I can see why people take him. He's super explosive, super fun to watch. The only downside on Butters, from my experience from owning him last season, there's just times where it felt like he really struggled to get to 120 plus in a SuperCoach scoring sense. There's times where he just dominated and scored 70 plus quarters, but I think at times, especially middle of the season when players start to fatigue and whatnot as the season is quite lengthy, those he was needing basically a 70 plus 3 in the third quarter to make it to 130. So he has these bursts where he explodes, and that showed when he scored 175 early in the season. But there's times where I've felt really frustrated as an owner where he was at 50 at 3/4 time and really struggled to even get to an 80. Even though his floor isn't that low, there were times where he struggled to get to a great score. And that's the frustrating thing for me as a Butters owner. He need to work a lot harder to get those points. And there's times where he'll dominate and score berserk, but there are times where he'll really struggle. So I think out of the two, I'll still stick with Butters in comparison to Neil, for the reason being that Butters is, always going to be in that starting rotation, no doubt about it. But Neil, who knows, with the Ashcroft brothers coming in, whether that'll impact his rotation in the midfield. Do they rest him more often? Now they've got more of a luxury to throw more in there, but time will tell. But I think out of the two, I'll lean with Butters. But moving towards the third bit of the 600k midfield before we start going a bit cheaper, is the last two that are kind of SuperCoach relevant. We'll touch on any others that we've missed on afterwards. But Caleb Sarong and Zach Merritt, I had both in my side. I'm not exactly sure if I had both to start with. Pretty sure I brought in Sarong pretty early. I don't not sure if I'd merit for at least the majority of the season. But these guys are essentially a step down again from the 650, 640k mark to the 620k mark, so a lot more affordable in that sense. 17% owned, 18%, 8% owned respectively. Both average pretty much bang on 115. Very similar kind of scoring trends with the ability to score nuts. With Sarong, high score of 170, Merritt, high score of 145. Very durable players. What are your thoughts on these two? I believe you don't have either on your starting side, but if you had to pick one, who would you pick, or do you reckon you can start with both?
Yeah, so I don't have either of them. So that is a disclaimer. I've sort of gone the high route with Butters and Dacos, as I've touched on. And the fourth player in there, I'm sure we're going to touch on in a minute. But yeah, in terms of these two, if you are looking for perhaps a cheaper option, I think these are the way you're sort of going to go in that 600k range. Because I'm just looking here now, and basically the only other players above 600k in the midfield are Flanders, who have already talked about in our defensive podcast. Heaney, I think, is too flaky. Trelaw is injury prone. And Josh Dunkley, who, has a super coach game. But yeah, again, there's that question mark of, what does Ashcroft do? What does Ashcroft do? So, I feel like that perhaps his price is a bit inflated, just given the fact that for Will Ashcroft at least, that he didn't play a lot of last year as he was still recovering from that ACL. So I feel like Dunkley's a bit overpriced. So if you are going for, the sub 630k option, these are definitely the two. I have to say, I'm not massive fans of both of these guys from a super coach perspective. I feel like they're more your AFL fantasy player in that they need a lot of disposals to, score well. The one thing I think that tips this sort of debate towards merit is purely, I think, his disposal efficiency is really quite good among these higher priced players, and I still think Sarong has a lot of growth in him, whereas I think Merritt is basically at the peak of his powers, and whatnot. And I think so I think if I've got to pick between one of them, it's not very convincing, because, as I said, I haven't really given these guys a lot of thought. But I think out of these two, I think I'd be leaning towards Merritt, even though I think Fremantle are probably going to be a big riser across the year. I've got them definitely making the 8. If they don't make the 8, I think there's serious questions. But I think for mine, I think I would just lean towards Merritt and save yourself the 2.3k. And pick up someone who's a little bit more unique, because, I don't think you can go wrong with either of them. But I think for mine, I think I just prefer Merritt just at this stage.
Yeah, I'm a 50-50 with these ones. No doubt you probably end up having both at some point in this finishing side. Like, as a disclaimer, we're more talking these are starting picks rather than, finishing them and top 8. Like, ideally, all 6 of these players you'd kind of want if you can afford as your finishing side in SuperCoach by the season's end. I'll probably flip ship and maybe go Sarong ahead of Merritt if I had to pick the two. I think Merritt's more the case that he both need, as Nathan said, I do agree in the fact that both need a lot of disposals to score well. That's what I found, having been an owner of both. Merritt, it was frustrating at times because he's, I reckon, the most elite ball user going around the competition. He is so important for Eston's ball movement. He's super, super clean with his disposal. There's rarely a game where he'll have a really poor disposal efficiency game, but it felt like he needed to do so much work to get to 130 plus. He needed 25 disposals, couple tackles, couple goals to really get going. But when he did fire, he really dominated. And Sarong similarly needed, 35. His disposal wasn't as good. Sarong seems to handle a lot more compared to kicking. He is very elite in that contested area, but doesn't probably utilise his foot skills as much. He's very much in and under play, gets it out to the likes of Hayden Young and co. But he was very capable of scoring those 170s early in the season. But I'm just going to bring up his scoring from the back end of the season, which is a bit concerning for super coaches, because if you look at his scoring, pretty much in the middle block. Oh, actually, nah, I'll take that back. It wasn't actually too bad. There was that middle patch where from, round 11 to 18, he only scored the ton twice, but then he basically tonned up from 19 onwards. His big end blocks of scoring from rounds 1 to 9 was very impressive. 170, 141, 125. And then back-to-backs of 140, 137, 150 from rounds 7 to 10. So, yeah, he's one that I think he's probably a bit more capable than Merritt to get those higher scores. And just looking at Merritt's score, I'm just going to bring it up quickly on my screen now. But Merritt probably didn't have as many consecutive high scores. Just don't know why this is working. Here we go. Didn't have. He went on a tear from rounds 1 to 9, scoring consistently in the hundreds, but after that was a bit sporadic with his scoring. Would go some 78s, 82s, and he's probably that massive ceiling wasn't there as much, and that probably correlated with Eston's decline in a sense throughout that season last year, where they started off really strong and everyone thought they were a shoo-in for finals, and then they kind of fell off a ship a little bit, and that correlated with Merritt falling apart a bit. And I think the difference here as well is, as Nathan rightly mentioned, is Freo's on the way up and probably should play finals this year, and Essendon are a bit of in that no man's land where we don't exactly know what we're going to get from Essendon this season, and Merritt's probably a big factor in getting Essendon back up the ranks in 2025, but better side usually means better midfield scoring most of the time. And if Sarong can kind of find ways to avoid the tag as well, he kind of struggled a lot last year trying to get rid of the tag in stages. I think at points they were playing him off a wing and a half forward to get rid of the tag. If he can get rid of that, I think his scoring will definitely benefit from, and hopefully we see those 120s and 130s a lot more consistently, or 120 pluses on a much more consistent basis. But if I had to pick, I'd probably, if I were, deciding between the two and from a starting side, I'd probably pick Sarong just on the basis of getting those high scores, or the potential for those super high scores more frequently. Because I think Merritt's just your very consistent player. He won't deviate off that 600k mark much at all, which is what I found, which was quite nice to picking him up in SuperCoach, because you didn't have to worry about riding the wave and picking up at a low score or selling him off at a high price, whatnot. Whereas Sarong, in comparison, I think he dropped down quite significantly last year when he had that down patch for a little bit, and people picked him up quite cheaply from pretty much that round 18 onwards. So he's a bit more of a roller coaster in price, but I think if you start him, I wouldn't be surprised he reaps the benefits of some super high scores early. But yeah, I'd lean towards Sarong just over Merritt. But moving on to the step down, so these are your 500k players, not that much further down. We're basically going down each slide here, but the 500k bracket presents itself more value than anything. I guess there's maybe a little bit more risk because these guys are prone to scoring a few less hundreds, but I guess it's more reflective of their season to date last year than more consistency's sake, because both these players have been in and around the mark for a couple seasons now. But what are your thoughts on these two in particular, Brayshaw and Steele? I'm obviously brought Steele in as a St Kilda supporter, so I've got a bit more knowledge in regards to Steele's performances and things like that in 2024. But what are your thoughts on Brayshaw and Steele in particular? I know that Brayshaw's ownership, I know it's 9% at the moment, but it was talked about in SuperCoach circles quite heavily as a person that can really step up into that kind of M2 to 3 bracket. And I guess Steele, there's conversation around potentially being a really good point of difference this year, maybe, and how that midfield mix works with McRae to help him and things like that. But what are your thoughts on these two in particular?
Yeah, so obviously these two are a run down from the top 8. So Brayshaw was 13th last year among all midfielders, including DPP midfielders. And Jack Steele was 15th. So obviously you're not getting a top 8 midfielder, which is ideally what you would want at the end of the year. So in terms of both of them, I mean, if you're after a cheaper midfielder, again, I feel like both of these guys are viable. I don't have either of them. But I think if I had to pick one, I think I would lean towards Brayshaw. Just because, as I touched on with Sarong, I feel like Fremantle are going to be on the up this year. I think they have to, at minimum, play finals football. If not, at least get a home final like they did in 2022. Whereas for St Kilda, I feel like the third year now under Ross, I feel like that they've got to start making some headway as well. But I just don't think they're going to get into that sort of top 8 where ideally they'd like to be, just with all these injuries as well. But yeah, you can't deny that both of them are really good scorers. But I think for mine, I think I would just be leaning towards Brayshaw on this one, and it's more so just with the fact that I feel like that if Fremantle are going to rise up the ladder, I think Brayshaw has to get that average from 109.8. Oh, it's right there. Up to the 115, 120 mark. And really push up with, the guys like Dacos and, Sarong and Trelaw, and really establish himself as a top, 6 super coach player this year for Fremantle to really cash in on that. I think he's at the right age group to do that as well. So, yeah, I feel like for mine, I feel like out of this battle, I would be leaning towards Brayshaw. But I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on when you're a St Kilda supporter. So perhaps you're a little bit more, clued on with how Steele scores and whatnot. But yeah, I think for mine, just purely looking at it from unbiased, I think I would be leaning towards Brayshaw.
Yeah, I tend to agree, majoritively speaking, with Brayshaw. I think Steele, being an owner basically every year, I basically pick him with the knowingly there's probably a downfall happening in some degree. Steele's, yeah, he gets injured at crucial stages where you really don't want that to happen, which is frustrating. Had that shoulder problem for ages, and then has had other niggles along the way. Just gets battered up a little bit in our midfield, just being that number one midfielder there. That's why I think I put him in there, mainly because I think McRae's going to help him just steady the ship a little bit, having another experienced head in there, and then you've got the third rung of midfielders to help him out, like Philippou when he's back fit. We had Garcia in there and matched him today, which dominated, who's a name that we'll talk about in the forward line when we do that episode. But I think there's a fair few now players that will kind of help Steele out a little bit, whereas in seasons gone by, it was basically Steele, Seb Ross, who's not an A-grader by any means, and then whoever else was available, like Sinclair would roll in there, and anyone else, Zach Jones. And when you've got a lineup of Steele, Seb Ross, and Zach Jones, you can't expect Steele to score super amazingly once pressure's on him from opposition midfielders. And I think I saw on Twitter that he would have scored around about 130 AFL fantasy points in that Carlton match sim. So definitely quite impressive from a scoring point of view. I think the impressive thing with Steele is he just gets the job done. He's not a player that you need to see on the screen 1,000 times to make sure he's scoring well. He kind of will get his scoring through his tackles and contested possessions, and he'll get the ball enough because he's going to be in the midfield rotation, barring injury. I think maybe if he's, as long as Touchwood, he doesn't have any injury niggles that pop up throughout preseason, maybe this is the first year in a while where he's got a full clean bill of health going into the season, and he's really confident with his own body as well. That's super important. Brayshaw, on the other hand, I've had in my team for a little bit. I think he was in my team pre-season. Hasn't left my team as of yet. He's probably the first one that will, if that's the case. He definitely ended the season very, very strongly. That's why a lot of people, I believe, brought him into their pre-season sides thinking that he's got that ability to step up into the next echelon of midfielders. He's got captaincy written all over him, or captaincy material written all over him. I know St Kilda were interested as a bit of trade bait to potentially bring Brayshaw in if they had the funds, and Brayshaw was willing to move in. But if you just look at his back end of scoring, pretty much from round 15, he dropped 2 sub-hundreds, 85 and a 77. The rest were over 100, and out of those hundreds, only one was sub 110, and that was bang on 100. So if you look at that sample size from round 15 to 24, that's super impressive. That's well over his current season average from last year. So, yeah, he's definitely capable, and I guess you kind of go back into the fact of how these teams going overall as a midfield group, and you look at Brayshaw, Sarong, and they brought in Shea Bolton as well, and they just look like they're on the up again. Whereas St Kilda are probably one or two more injuries away from really struggling as a midfield group. They looked very vulnerable at times in centre bounce clearances today in that match simulation early days, and they definitely improved on that as the game went on. But if you look at these two sides from a midfield perspective, you take Freo's midfield all day compared to St Kilda's, as much as that hurts to say. And I think that is what it comes down to, with the ability for Brayshaw to score a bit more of that consistent 130s, 140s. Still was super consistent as well for the majority of the season, but just wasn't hitting the ceiling as consistently. I think that 143 was pretty much a pretty sparse score out of his entire season from last year. So Brayshaw's probably got that ceiling a bit more consistently ahead of him. But I'd probably lean towards Brayshaw as well. I don't think I'll start Brayshaw and Sarong, just because I've never really have started two of the same team.
Yeah, I wouldn't be doing that either.
Just because if they do get beaten badly in a week and they both score poorly because their whole midfield's gotten beaten, that's an issue. But I think Brayshaw is ready to take the next step forward into that kind of top tier midfielder, and I think this is his time now, and this is Freo's time now to really step into that top 4, top 6 conversation about really stepping into a finals or consistent finals contention. And I think Brayshaw is a big piece in that. And I guess the other benefit with Brayshaw is the fact that he probably doesn't cop the tag or attention as much as Sarong. I know other teams in the past have basically flipped between the two of them depending on who's popping off, but I think Sarong is probably going to get a bit more attention. He's a bit easier to nullify, whereas Brayshaw has that contested ball in him and is very reliant on tackles as well. So I'd probably lean towards Brayshaw just slightly over Steele, as much as that hurts me saying. But yeah, Brayshaw I think's a go in that one. But moving on to the cheaper end of things before we wrap it up. As we said, we can't, as we've said before, we can't really pick every single 500, 600k plus midfielder and stack them in your team and hope for the best. You need to find value somewhere. And these two players really fit the bill in this category, and we're probably blessed in the fact that these two have shown potential to score hundreds consistently, and that's Will Day and Clayton Oliver. I have a feeling I know what you're going to say, Nathan, straight away based off our conversation off air. But what are your thoughts on these two? Will Day's price just under 500, hasn't really had a consistent bill of health, which is half the reason why he hasn't had to be able to get that average above 100 on a consistent enough basis. Oliver, we all know, is an insanely good Supercoach scorer when fully fit. Had his problems last season, seems to be tearing the house down pre-season and match sim. Based at 450k, which is as cheap as you'll ever see Oliver starting. What are your thoughts on these two? Is any of these two a trap, and do you think they're just too good not to pass up on?
Nah, I'd be picking Oliver all the way. I think he's definitely going to be a top 10 midfielder at least by the end of the year. He could not have had a worse preseason last year. And he was basically playing catch up for the whole year. So to get a fit, basically a non-news full preseason into Clayton Oliver, I think he's primed to get himself back up into that top echelon of midfielders. He's at the right age for it. I feel like Melbourne are sort of on their last chance. I know they got the premiership in 2021, but they haven't won a final since then. And obviously, it completely fell away last year. But I feel like that the fact that there hasn't really been any news out of Melbourne this entire summer, really, I think is a great thing for them as a club. It means that they can just let their football do the talking, as opposed to, all these off-field dramas, with the illicit drugs saga with Joel Smith, with the president, with Oliver's mental health. All of that seems to be, at least for now, consigned to the past. And if you watch today's practice match, Oliver basically started in the midfield and was basically just about the best midfielder for the 3 quarters that he played. So I just think that this is a no-brainer. I just think that if you're going to pit anyone around Oliver's price, and give me an option, I'm always leaning towards Oliver, because we know that it wasn't an injury-affected, situation as to why his scoring dropped off. It was more his own mental health. But yeah, he looked prime today. He dominated that North Melbourne midfield. And yeah, I just think that at this stage, if you can basically get a proven top 10 scorer who's basically not injury affected at 450k, I think you'd be crazy to not at least take the risk on him. And yeah, hope that he can, get back to that, 600, 650k price range that we know that he's capable of. So I think the last time he started this cheap, so I just want to have a quick look. So I think the last time he started this cheap, was in his second year. I think he was about a similar. He was a very similar price, I think, in his second year. I'll just get it up now. So he started 2017. He started at 382, and he finished at 565k. And then 2018, he started above 600k, and basically was that every year. So realistically, you're getting him at his cheapest price since 2017. And that year he averaged 111. When he's what, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. This is his 10th season, so he's right in that window. And you just have to go back to 2023. He averaged 120.6. And I think he finished the year as like the he finished the year in 2023. He finished not 2023, So he finished 2022 as the second ranked player in SuperCoach. So I don't see any reason why he can't get back to that. So yeah, I just think that this is a no-brainer. Will Day, look, don't have any knocks on Will Day. I think you can probably justify picking him if you think Hawthorn are going to keep their rise up the ladder. But I think there's a lot safer option going with Oliver. Just because he's got there before, and as I said, it's not like it's an injury-affected score. He's not coming off an ACL or a shoulder reconstruction. It was purely his own mental health and well-being, which, as we've said all summer, we haven't heard any of the thing about it. So I just think lock and load Oliver. He's right now currently my 4th midfielder, and I'm basically treating him as a premium midfielder. Who is 150k under what a premium midfielder should be, because I just think that he looks back to his best, and I think today will only reaffirm that decision that I've had, and I feel like a lot of other people who's sort of taken a plunge on him as well. That he looks back to his best, and if you can scrape him down to M5, that's probably even better. But he just doesn't fit for me at M5, so. I think just lock and load on Oliver, because I think out of all the plays sort of sub 500k, I think he's by far and away the best option, unless you're going all the way down to a rookie.
Yeah, no, I do agree. Oliver's definitely presented value, and I guess, as you said, it was.
Have you got him?
Yeah, I've got him M4 at the moment. I did have Will Day and Oliver, so I'm still tinkering with regards to whether I want both. From the clips that I saw from the Geelong Hawthorn match simulation, Day looked almost like the best Hawthorn midfielder out there. Got his run and flare back. They used him a lot through the corridor, pushing the ball forward. And yeah, he's a very hard player to match up against due to just kind of his build and his ability to run and carry the ball. I guess the biggest flip side or the downside for Day is that injury concerns. He just seems to get injured at the wrong points of the season, with all these little niggles here and there, which really hurt him. But I think he's definitely capable of pushing up his average into the hundreds quite comfortably this year, just with the way all Hawthorn's, I mean, we'll talk about this when we talk about the team's predictions moving into the first round, but I'm probably a little bit more bullish on the Hawks to see how they go, and I don't think they'll probably be as an easy run as what people think they are in 2025. But yeah, I think Day's will be a big help to push the Hawks into top 4 credentials again. And yeah, I think he's a really consistent performer on the field when he is fit, and I think that's the biggest question. If he can just stay fit and be healthy throughout the season, I don't see why not. He can really improve that average because he's shown in glimpses he can, and he's in that discounted price because of the injury-affected season he had last year and whatnot. But I guess if I had to pick the two, Oliver is probably the way to go for me. He just shows when he's got that fresh mind, fresh body, he's going to go back into that kind of 120s consistent enough basis, I believe. I think Melbourne needing to really perform to get back to where they were in previous seasons gone by, and it shows that he hasn't been this low for ages. And I think you'd be kicking yourself a little bit if you didn't pick him up at this cheapest price, and then you kind of forced yourself to pick him up 100k more expensive and whatever. And I think if you do pick him up at that cheaper price, if he does for whatever reason have an injury, touch wood, or not get back to his best and really struggle with those low hundreds and high 90s, whatever scoring, you can flip either way. So I would say get Clary 40k cheaper, probably the way to go. But I do like the idea of having both because I think they're both capable of scoring good hundreds this season. But moving on to the final two that we have in today's episode is, I know I've put in 350k plus and one of them's about 440, but there wasn't too many options going down. And half the reason I put in the 350k plus is a man called James Peatling from the Crows. Showed when he played for the Giants, was one of the better midfielders in that group, just with his two-way defensive running ability. Seemed to score really healthy because of that. Seemed to impress in the match simulation against Port Adelaide in that midfield rotation. Will Ashcroft won the Norm Smith in their premiership winning year last year. Obviously, as Nathan said, is that discounted price because of that time he's taken to get his ACL right. What are your thoughts on these two? Have you got either in your side at the moment? Do you see yourself getting these players in? What are your thoughts on these two in particular? I know Ashcroft probably comes with a bit of a caveat in the fact that he's got that early bar as well, so it's how many you can stack in without really stuffing up your score round 3. But what are your thoughts on these two in particular?
Yeah, I mean, I have to say I haven't got either of them at this stage. I think out of the two, I see this is a tough one, I think, because I feel like Peatling is actually a better option. But then there's the whole idea of him moving to another club, and quite often players can take a season or two to adjust to a new club. But I have to say, in the match simulation, he did look very good through that midfield group. So I think for him, it's more just about getting opportunities in the midfield. And as for Will Ashcroft, I do think there is a little bit of overhype from the Norm Smith medal. I'm not denying that he has got talent, because obviously you don't win a Norm Smith medal if you're not talented. But for mine, if I'm looking at Oliver and Will Ashcroft, who I think are basically the same price, I think I'm leaning more towards Oliver. Again, just purely because I know that Oliver's done it. I think Ashcroft might get there one day as well. He does have a very SuperCoach friendly role because he is that inside player at Brisbane alongside Lachie Neale. So that I don't think there's any long-term question marks about him. I think he will sort of get up around that 600k price range soonish. It's just when. But I think at this stage, if you're giving me Oliver and Will Ashcroft, I still think I'm leaning towards Oliver just because I know that he's done it before. And then I think if you're looking at these two, I don't know if either of them are going to be a top sort of 10 or 15 midfielder, which is ideally what you'd want if you're picking someone at this price range. So for mine, I have both of them. I haven't considered either of them. I've actually been surprised the fact that Will Ashcroft is a 24% ownership. Given his price, it is really awkward. But there's no denying the talent is there for Ashcroft. But yeah, I think even Peatling at 22% was a bit surprising. So I don't know if players out there are sort of going the Russian roulette route and they're just picking, 4 mid prices and hoping that, they become top 20 players, which I think is very, very risky to do that because I know the Bontempelli is not even in the top 10 most popular midfielders. So, I can't speak on behalf of other people, but I feel like you can probably only have at most one, maybe two midfielders under 500k. And I feel like that the two we had on the previous slide with Will Day and Clary Oliver are probably better options than both of these guys. But, who am I to, knock both of them? They're both probably going to be good, players one day. But yeah, as I said, I think Peatling's too awkwardly priced. And Will Ashcroft, I think there is a bit of hype with him after the Norm Smith medal.
Yep.
But I'm just not quite sure yet if he's ready to be, a top 10, top 15 midfielder. So, I think for mine, both of these are passed, but I'm not going to, go out and say don't pick them. But yeah, I'm just sort of more going out there and saying that if you're stacking your midfield with Day and Oliver and Peatling and Ashcroft, it can blow up really quickly. So,
Yep.
I guess just tread that with caution. But yeah, I feel like if you're going to compare these two directly against the first two, I think I would have more confidence in picking the first two players as opposed to Peatling or Ashcroft. So
Yep.
that's sort of why I have avoided both of them for the time being.
Yeah, I don't have either currently at the moment. If I do were to pick, probably pick Peatling just because of almost a 100k discount from the 400k players. You probably have a bit more wiggle room if he does blow up in your face and can either go down or up accordingly. He's probably going to get a bit more opportunity at the Crows, I think, with the Giants. It was only really in the latter half of the season where they really unleashed him as that kind of two-way defensive midfielder, and they've got the likes. They've got Tom Green, Josh Kelly, Caniglio when he's fit. So they've got star-studded midfielders everywhere. So it's kind of hard to put him in that category. And he definitely had to work hard to push into it when he was playing his best towards the final series. And I think the Crows, my biggest knock with them was they were just way too slow and just way too one-rounded. One-dimensional. And Dawson wasn't his best. Crouch was basically racking it up for fun, but not really doing anything with it. And I think Peatling's going to really help with that. And I've heard that potentially maybe because Peatling goes in that midfield, then Rory Laird goes off halfback. That provides another dynamic for the Crows because Peatling provides that defensive pressure that Laird did in the midfield when he was there playing full time. So I can see if that's the case, then potentially Peatling can score quite nicely on a consistent enough basis. Whereas Ashcroft, I just can't see. I've had him in my side and taken him out, but I just can't see that having him, Dacos, and if you want to bring in, Dane Zorko even in the back line or whatever, you can't just have too many of these round three players and round three bye players, sorry. And I do think, Nathan's right in the fact that everyone just saw him at the Norm Smith and how much he dominated in that game. But having said that, pretty much 99% of those Lions players dominated the Swans on that day. So, yeah, it's a hard one to see. I'd probably want to see for at least a couple of rounds, at least before price changes do happen, how that Brisbane mix will go. And it seems like it's Dunkley, Neal and Ashcroft at this point in time, which is definitely great, but it'll be interesting to see how that scoring pie affects those three players, who gets the majority of it and how the scoring deviates. But I think having Ashcroft, Day and Oliver as those 400k players in your side is pretty risky. We saw it last year with the likes of having, I think it was Ollie Wines and Crouch, and it was already very dicey early days, and then people were chopping and changing, and then it turned out Crouch was a pretty good option, and then people already traded him out and vice versa. So it's very hard to really gauge how that scoring is going to act with so many of those 400k players being viable options this year. But I think if I had to pick one, probably would be Peatling, because I think you could potentially still get away with the fact if you went two of Ashcroft, Day and Oliver and still had Peatling in his side because he's got that 100k discount on those two. But as I said, it's still risky in its own right. But I think Peatling's going to get a lot more opportunity at the Crows and probably show his ability to be a dominant defensive midfielder. And I think that'll help his scoring tenfold with that tackling pressure and that two-way running. I think it's been quite impressive for the Crows this season and a big reason why they're probably going to bounce back up this year. But yeah, if I said where to pick between the two, probably Peatling just with that discounted price. But before we wrap it up, Nathan, is there anyone, I know we've just hit the hour mark, so probably not going to go through any other players, just because I don't want to go too much over this hour with how lengthy these episodes can be. But is there anyone quickly off the bat that you can recognise? I know Chera, a few people talked about, he wasn't super impressive in that Blues Saints match him this afternoon or this morning. Sorry. What are your thoughts on any other midfielders that you think might make a name for themselves this year and present themselves as potential smokies for a starting price or starting pick? Sorry.
Yeah, so I'll just quickly go through a few of them. So LDU, I think, is definitely a viable pick out of contract. We know the players who are out of contract tend to perform better because they're thinking about, the big money contract move. So I think LDU is definitely a viable option. If Christian Petrarca is named round one, I'd be tempted. I don't think I'd start with him, but I'd chuck him on the watch list. Just because you know what Petrarca is capable of if he's fit and firing. Adelaide, I feel like couldn't be any worse than they were last year. So I feel like that brings Dawson and Laird right back into the foray. I know Roy Laird's playing off a half-back line this year, which is where he started. So perhaps he can present some value there. Although I don't even know where Laird is. Is he even a midfielder this year?
Yeah, he should be.
I haven't even seen. Oh, there he is, 561.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I think Laird and Dawson present can pick up. But having a look through, you've got Wines. I think Connor Rosie needs to have a big year this year. Port Adelaide's captain. He only averaged 98.3. That's, in my eyes, probably 10 or 15 under where he should be. And then, you're sort of now getting down into, the 400k players where, I'm not sure if I'd be picking these guys. Darcy Parish is a proven scorer, but unfortunately just struck down with injury. Pendlebury, unfortunately, is probably past his prime now. And then, you're sort of getting down into, the 400k players. The Goey, I think, presents good value, but again, he just cannot get on the park. Harley Reid's an interesting one, but again, I'm not sure how he's going with his concussion. And then, you're basically getting down now into the sort of the 400k players. Dylan Shield, put a little asterisk on Dylan Shield. If this halfback role works for him, I think his scoring can spike. And I feel like he can become a viable option only as a defender. I wouldn't be starting him purely as a midfielder. But if he moves to halfback, I think that might be a good move. And if he can keep his scoring up, all good. And then, you're basically now down into the sort of, the 300k players here. And I think, Peatland's the only one who I think I would have any confidence at all in picking. So, I think it's sling pickings under 500k this year, which is why I said I think Oliver and they are probably the best way to go if you're tossing up between two of them. And then I don't think there's anyone really under 400k other than probably Pete Ling, at least who's a pure midfielder. So that's excluding DPP, players, because there are a few forwards who are probably going to touch on the door in this price range. It's in terms of a pure midfielder. I think it's basically going to be those guys who, we touched on under that 500k price range, and everyone else, I think, is just a hard pass until you get down to, your Lawlers at the low 200, at the low 200s, and then, you're into Jager Smith and, Finn O'Sullivan. So realistically, I think it's bare this year other than those four. I think obviously your midfield's where you're going to get most of your points. So you're going to sort of do your most research in here. It should be interesting. But there's sort of some other options who I think are definitely viable, just having a first glance at them.
Yeah. No, 100% agree. I think, it'd be interesting to see how SuperCoach stack up this season. The forward line, which we'll head up next, is a minefield with so many good options. With regards to that really cheap 300 to 400k range, which will allow you to probably facilitate some big hitters in the midfield. But yeah, interesting to see how people go if they do decide to go rookie heavy with so many viable rookies at the moment for the midfield group as well. But yeah, time will tell. And I guess the next week of practice or official practice round games will kind of solidify people's decisions making in whether they go that mid-price route or they go with the guns and rookies of old in the midfield group. But definitely one to be really mindful of, as your midfield can really make or break your side, that's for sure. But other than that, that's all we got time for today. Hopefully you've been able to say at the end of this bumper episode. I know it's going over an hour, but there's definitely lots of good information to kind of take away from even this smaller sample size of selections. That, you know, there's a lot of options that you can choose and a lot of that will work, but I guess it's really important to get that midfield mix right. But other than that, we'll be back for a bumper episode for the forward line, which will definitely be a juicy option. And other than that, we'll catch you for the next one.